I realized something was wrong when the time didn't match the light anymore. I checked the time again, but it didn't match the light anymore. The sun should still have been above the ridge, but everything had already flattened into that dull grey that usually comes later in the day. I tried to remember when I had last stopped, but I couldn't place it clearly. I knew the trail wasn't long enough to explain how late it suddenly felt. The path itself was simple, just a narrow line cutting across loose rock and patches of grass, nothing that required much focus. But the air had changed. Not gradually. It had just dropped. Colder than it should have been, like stepping into a different part of the day without noticing when it happened. I picked up my pace without thinking about it. The wind had started to come across the slope in uneven bursts, strong enough to push against me every few steps. It wasn't constant, which made it harder to adjust to. I kept looking ahead for any sign of the lower section of the trail, but visibility was already starting to change. A thin layer of fog had formed between the rocks, low at first, then slowly rising. I told myself it was just weather moving in faster than expected. That happens in the mountains. You learn not to question it too much. Still, something about the timing didn't sit right. It felt like I had missed something without realizing it. I stopped for a moment and looked back up the trail. The path behind me looked the same as it had earlier. Nothing obviously wrong. No sign of anyone else. No movement. Nothing out of place. But the silence felt different. Not empty. Just flatter somehow, like sound wasn't carrying the way it should. I stood there longer than I meant to, trying to listen for anything that would explain it. There was nothing, just the wind coming and going in uneven bursts. I turned back and kept moving. Faster now. A few minutes later, I saw the hut. It sat slightly below the trail, built into the slope with dark wood that blended into the rock behind it. I hadn't planned to stop there, but at that point it felt like the only reasonable option. The wind had picked up again, stronger this time, pushing loose gravel across the path. The fog had risen higher as well, making it harder to judge distance. I stepped off the trail and moved toward the hut, adjusting my footing on the uneven ground. The door wasn't fully closed. It rested against the frame, shifting slightly with each gust. I slowed down as I got closer. That wasn't unusual, but it still made me hesitate for a second before reaching for the door. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was darker than I expected. There was a small window on the far side, but it didn't let in much light anymore. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust. There was a bench along one wall, a rough table, and a metal stove in the corner. The air felt cold, like no one had been there for a while. But someone was sitting on the bench. I stopped just inside the doorway. He didn't look up right away, just sat there, leaning forward slightly, hands resting on his knees. For a second I thought he hadn't noticed me. Then he lifted his head, slowly, too slowly, like the movement took effort. He looked at me for a few seconds before speaking. "Didn't expect anyone up here," I said. He kept looking at me for a moment longer than felt normal. "Yeah," he said. "Same." The delay stuck with me. Not enough to question directly, but enough to notice. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, more out of instinct than anything else. The wind outside hit harder now, pushing unevenly against the walls. I set my bag down near the table and rubbed my hands together, trying to get some warmth back. "You been here long?" I asked. He looked toward the window, then back at me. "Not sure," he said. That didn't make sense. If he didn't know how long he'd been there, something was already wrong. I looked at the stove again. Cold, no ash, no heat, nothing. If he had really been here for a while, it shouldn't have felt like this. "You mind if I start a fire?" I asked. He shook his head slightly. I crouched down and started setting it up, using what dry material I could find inside. It took a minute, but eventually I got a small flame going. The light shifted across the room, shadows moving along the walls. I glanced over at him again. He hadn't moved, not even slightly. "You hiking up or down?" I asked. "Up," he said. I nodded slowly. Bit late for that. He didn't respond. The wind hit the hut again, harder this time, the wood shifting slightly under the pressure. I stayed crouched near the fire for a few seconds longer than I needed to, just watching the flames settle into something steady. The warmth helped, but it didn't change the feeling in the room. It was still too still. I stood up and brushed my hands together. "Weather came in fast," I said. He nodded. But again, there was that delay. Not long, just enough to notice it each time. I moved toward the table, adjusting my bag slightly, mostly to give myself something to do. My eyes kept going back to him without me meaning to. Same position, same posture, like he hadn't shifted at all since I walked in. That's when I noticed his boots properly. They were clean. Not just less dirty than mine, completely clean, no dust, no mud, nothing from the trail outside. That didn't match anything about getting up there. "You come up today?" I asked. He looked at me again, a little too long, then nodded. "Yeah." I glanced at the door, then back at him. The fire cracked softly behind me. "Trail was clear?" I asked. He didn't answer, just kept looking at me. Then, after a few seconds, "Didn't see anyone." "That's not what I asked," I said. He didn't react to that. No change in expression. No shift in posture, just watching. The wind hit the hut again, stronger this time, making the door move slightly in its frame. I stepped a little closer to it without thinking. Not enough to make it obvious. Just enough to feel like I had a way out. "You okay?" I asked. He nodded, but it felt like a delayed copy of what I expected, not an actual response. I shifted my weight, looking toward the small window. Outside, the fog had thickened. You couldn't see more than a few meters now. The wind pushed through it in uneven waves, making it move in ways that didn't feel consistent. I turned back toward him. He was still watching me. Same angle, same stillness. "You been up here before?" I asked. A pause, and then, "Yeah." "How often?" He didn't answer. The silence stretched again, longer this time. I exhaled slowly and reached down for my bag. I didn't want to stay there any longer. It wasn't just the way he answered. It was that he hadn't moved at all since I walked in. Not once, and I couldn't tell if he was watching me or just waiting for something. The wind outside hit the hut again, harder this time. Cold air pushed through the gaps in the wood. There was no way I was making it down safely in that. I knew that. I just didn't like what the alternative was. I stayed. The light dropped faster after that. The small fire became the only thing moving in the room. Everything else stayed still. He didn't move, not when the wind hit the walls, not when the fire cracked, not even when I shifted or stood up. I tried not to look at him directly anymore, but I could feel it, that he was still facing me. At some point, I noticed something else. I hadn't seen him blink. I adjusted the fire just to have something to do. When I looked back up, his posture had changed. Not gradually, just different. He was sitting more upright now, facing me directly. I hadn't seen him move. I knew I hadn't. I stayed where I was, not wanting to make it obvious that I had noticed. The room felt smaller now. The firelight pushed shadows into the corners, but none of them moved except the flame itself. I don't remember falling asleep. At some point, everything just went quiet. When I opened my eyes, the light had changed. grey morning light through the window. The fire was almost out, and the bench was empty. I sat there for a few seconds, not moving. Then I stood up slowly and looked around. No bag, no footprints inside, nothing that showed anyone had been there. I stepped outside. The air was still cold, but the wind had dropped. The ground was damp. There were no tracks leading away from the hut, just mine. I stood there longer than I meant to, trying to line it up with what I remembered. He had been there, sitting on the bench, looking at me, answering, even if it took him a second too long each time. But there was nothing outside that showed he had left. No second set of prints, no disturbance in the gravel, no sign of weight shifting away from the hut. I turned back toward the door and stepped inside again. The air felt the same as before. Cold, still. The fire had burned down to a thin layer of ash. The bench was empty, exactly where he had been sitting. I moved closer to it and put my hand against the wood. It was cold. No residual warmth, like no one had been there for hours. I looked around the room one more time. Table? Stove? Floor? Nothing out of place. No bag? No gear, no small detail I could point to and say that's where he was. I stayed there for a few seconds longer, expecting something to shift. A sound, movement, anything that would make it feel normal again. Nothing did. I stepped back outside and pulled the door toward Mimi. It didn't latch. It just rested against the frame, slightly open, moving a little with the wind, exactly the way it had when I first saw it. I stood there, looking at it, trying to decide if I had missed something obvious, if I had just misunderstood the whole situation. Then I turned and started down the trail. The fog had lifted enough that I could follow the path again. The ground felt more stable, the light more consistent. Everything looked normal. After a few minutes, I noticed something ahead of me again. At first I thought it was just uneven ground, then I saw the shape clearly. Footprints, fresh. Already there, leading down the path. I stopped walking. They hadn't been there when I came up. I was sure of that. And they were spaced exactly the way mine were. Same distance, same rhythm. Like someone had walked that trail ahead of me at the exact same pace. I didn't follow them this time. I just stood there for a second, looking at them, trying to decide if I was reading too much into it. Then I stepped off the trail and moved around them, and kept going without looking back. I kept walking until the trail widened and the ground turned to packed dirt. When I finally looked down again, there was only one set of tracks. Mine.